When you think of the Psalms, you might think of beautiful poetry, expressions of worship, maybe just Psalms that give comfort and strength, Psalms like Psalm 23. But did you know that the Psalms also give us powerful glimpses of Jesus? In fact, some of these are what we call Messianic Psalms because they specifically point forward to the Messiah, a word that means God's anointed one, God's chosen one, who we know as Jesus. Now, for centuries, God's people read these Psalms and prophecies, wondering when and how they would be fulfilled. They were looking for someone, waiting for someone. And when Jesus came, he brought these words to life. So what we're going to do is dive into just a few examples of how we see Jesus in these Messianic Psalms and prophecies in the Old Testament. We're going to start by looking at Psalm 2, a psalm about the anointed king. Psalm 2 starts by talking about nations rebelling, leaders plotting against God and against his anointed one, right? Once again, that word Messiah. And it's pretty intense, right? I mean, here's this picture of God laughing at the plans of these nations and kings and saying, I've installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. And it ends with a warning, kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way. And when we read this psalm, we can see that it's talking about a ruler chosen by God, but it's not just about any earthly king. In fact, the New Testament writers recognize that this psalm was about Jesus. When Jesus is baptized, God speaks from heaven saying, you are my son whom I love. Seems to be a pretty direct reference to Psalm 2. And when the early Christians faced persecution, they actually quoted Psalm 2 as they prayed, acknowledging that Jesus was the fulfillment of the prophecy. Jesus was the king promised, a king who would rule not just Israel, but all nations. Then there's Psalm 22, a psalm about the suffering servant. And if you've ever read it, it's like reading a description of the crucifixion written hundreds of years before Jesus was even born. It starts with the words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" which are the exact words Jesus cried out from the cross. And as you keep reading, it gets even more specific. The psalm talks about the people mocking him. They shake their heads at me. It even describes they pierce my hands and my feet. Here's the thing that's amazing about this. When David wrote this psalm, crucifixion didn't even exist yet. I mean, the Romans hadn't invented it yet. But somehow, through the Holy Spirit, David described Jesus' suffering exactly the way that it would be. And we can see clearly then that the Holy Spirit was involved in giving him the very words. This psalm gives us a clear picture of what Jesus endured, the depth of his suffering, and his love for us. It's like we're looking straight at the cross through David's words centuries before it happened. Now, in addition to the Psalms, we have a lot of prophecies, and then we're going to look specifically at Isaiah 53. Isaiah is sometimes called the fifth gospel because it so perfectly lays out the life and mission of Jesus. Describes him as a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, someone who was despised and rejected. Isaiah said he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. When we read this prophecy in Isaiah 53, it's hard to miss how directly it points to Jesus. It doesn't just hint at suffering. It talks about exactly the kind of suffering Jesus actually would go through and why. Isaiah tells us that this servant would take our sin, bear our punishment, bring us peace with God. That's the heart of the gospel. And that's why this matters. That's why we look back at these old texts when we already know who Jesus is, because seeing Jesus in these Psalms and prophecies shows us that God's plan of salvation didn't come out of nowhere. God has always been at work, guiding history towards Jesus. He's been writing this story from the beginning, and these Messianic Psalms, these Messianic prophecies, they're not just a side note. They're clues that God left along the way, showing us that he's been preparing this rescue plan all along. Maybe even more than that, these ancient words give us confidence that Jesus really is who he says he is. He didn't just show up and start making claims that were wildly out of the blue. His life, his death, his resurrection were all part of a plan God had revealed to his people centuries before. We don't have to take a blind leap of faith. God has given us a foundation of truth, words written long before Jesus that point directly to him. So the next time you're reading your Old Testament and you get into the Psalms or you're reading the prophets, make sure you're looking for Jesus. See him as the king in Psalm 2, as the suffering servant in Psalm 22, as the sacrifice in Isaiah 53. These aren't just old writings. They're powerful glimpses of God's heart and his plan for us, a plan that's fulfilled in Jesus. Remember, God has been faithful to every promise, every prophecy. He's always kept his words. That's good news for us, because if God kept his promises to bring us Jesus, we can trust he'll keep his promises to us now and for eternity.